What's up, everybody? Di D'Amato here, and welcome to Codecast Live. Today, what we're going to do is start talking about centering. Basically, talking about centering stuff that's in the web page. So we will put something in the web page like a HTML element and use some CSS in order to make it appear right in the center of the thing that we're, well, container or whatever we're trying to do. We're going to have a very simple example, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of how to center and why you might want to use one way over the other. I have the link to the pen that we're going to be working with in the description in below down there. So let's just get started. So I'm going to open up the pen right now. Here's the pen. You can see the ID of the pen right here if you want to type it in yourself. But again, I recommend you just go ahead and click the link. So the first thing we're going to do is actually make some HTML elements. If you are new to HTML, hopefully this isn't a little bit simple to understand. We're just going to be making some containers. So the first container we're going to make is something called a div. It's a pretty standard container here in HTML land. And then inside of the div, we're going to put a button. And inside of the content of the button is just going to say click me. Really simple like. Well, if I spell it right, of course. So there we go. We have click me right there. And you can see over here on the right hand side I have click me, which is great. Now you can't see the div. The div by default is basically invisible, but it does exist on the page. So what we'll do is we'll add a little bit of CSS in order for us to actually see the div. We won't need this HTML for right now, so you could double click the CSS. We'll open that up, and what we're going to do is select the div. So if you haven't seen CSS before, we're going to target the div by just typing in the word div for right now, and then a couple of squiggly braces, and hit enter. So everything that we add inside of the squiggly braces is going to affect the look of the div. And the first thing we're going to do is give it a background of red. I'm using the shorthand here just because I'm a developer and I'm lazy. So now we can see the area in which the div exists on our page, which is great. The next thing I'm going to do is actually make this thing a square. So I'm going to give it a defined width of 200 pixels and a defined height of 200 pixels. All right, so now we have a square. And this is going to be our base kind of look of the page that we're going to be working with. So the next couple of things we're going to do is actually center the button inside of the middle of our red div. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. The most common way that you'll see these days is using something called Flexbox. Now, we're not going to be using all of the best parts of Flexbox with this particular case, but one of the great parts about Flexbox is the ability to manage vertical and horizontal centering. So in order to do this, we're going to change the display property of the div to flex. I'll move my cursor there so you can see it. So display flex. Now it's going to make the button look a little weird, and that's okay. That's what it's expected so far. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to center the button horizontally. And the way that we're going to do that is using justify content, and then the key is going to be center. So justify content, the value is going to be center. So that'll actually center the button horizontally in our div. Now, you can think of justify content the same way as you would in your word processor. When you justify your text, you're justifying it to the left, justifying it to the right, or center justifying that text. So that's what we're doing here. We're doing it all horizontally. In order for us to affect the vertical, we're going to use something called align items. And this is going to center us vertically. Okay? Now, it's very common for even seasoned developers to get justify content and align items mixed up. You might say justify items or align content, and that's okay. It's totally fine to look this kind of stuff up. Actually, CSS Tricks has a great article about Flexbox and how to kind of manipulate it. But again, just for the purposes of our video today, this is the general setup of how you would center a thing inside of a container. Remember, we're putting these styles on the container, on the div, and we're actually affecting its direct children, which is, in this particular case, just the button. All right, so that's one way of centering, and again, we didn't even select the button in this particular case, which is great, but if we wanted to go ahead and do a different way, we can actually center the button another way using flex. So we're back to our almost original state, but I've kept the display flex on for now. And what we can do here is we could say button and then margin auto. And again, margin auto in this particular case is actually affecting an automatic margin around all four sides of the button. So if I was to actually say margin left auto, margin right auto, and be very explicit about it for each one, that could be something I do. Or I could also say auto a whole bunch of different times in here. That's not how you spell auto. Auto like this, and that'll affect the top and left, and then the top and bottom, and then the left and right. And I can type it in a whole bunch of times, but that's not necessary. All we need is the one auto, and that'll work. Now, again, I figured there'll be a question here about, well, what's the difference between using display flex with align items and justify content versus using margin auto on this button. Now, for a long time, I'll be honest, I actually didn't know what the difference really would be when it comes to using margin auto. But without actually going into too much detail in this particular case, I only found one instance where it does actually matter, and it actually has to do with the viewport. So what I typically like to do with my modals is I'll actually do a margin auto to keep the modal in the center of the page, as opposed to using justify content and align items. And what that helps with a little bit is sizing of that modal. Sometimes what will happen is if you use justify content and align items, you won't be able to scroll on the modal properly. Instead, the margin auto actually allows you to scroll on the modal, especially in the viewport when the modal ends up being bigger than the viewport. And you might ask yourself, well, when the heck does that happen? Well, it actually might happen when your modal is being viewed in a mobile device, so some kind of iPhone or Android device, or even, I don't know, BlackBerry. Sometimes if the screen size is too small and the modal you designed is, well, kind of too big or not prepared for that, margin auto ends up helping a lot more in this case than justify content and align items. So just something to be mindful of. There's actually another way that we can center something that's very similar to Flex, and it's actually using display grid. We should be able to do display grid here. And that's going to look a little ridiculous, but that's okay. We're going to work with it. And then we should actually be able to just say place items. And center. Let's see if that works. Perfect. Awesome. So this is kind of like a little shorthand. Instead of saying, display flex and align items and justify content, we can actually just say display grid, place items center. And what place items is actually doing is it's affecting both the horizontal and the vertical axis. It's the exact same kind of thing that our first example was doing. This is just a little less code. I think in some future they're expecting place items to actually be affected in Flexbox, and I'm not confident it's doing it right now. We can take a peek. Let's see. Always got to check, right? Yeah, so it doesn't exactly work here. It's doing vertical centering, but it's not doing the horizontal centering. I suppose you could also add like a, I don't know, a text align center maybe. Let's see if that does anything, because let's see if that works. Nope, that doesn't work. Sometimes what will happen is because the button is an inline kind of element, sometimes text align center will affect it, but it's probably not being affected because of display flex. I'm assuming if I do this, yeah, that'll center that, but then the place items thing won't work. So those are a couple of ways in order to like handle layout, specifically with display properties, in order to kind of center that child, center the button. So I'm going to show you one more way that we used to center stuff before we used things like Flexbox and Grid, and that was using position absolute. So first we actually are going to put position absolute on our button here, and we'll say position absolute, absolute, very nice. Okay, and you'll see that there's pretty much no change here. Now, position absolute is very specific about what it's being absolute to, and the answer to that is basically something called the most recent relative ancestor. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, the ancestor to the button in this particular case is the div, it's its parent. So your ancestors are your parents and your grandparents and great-grandparents and all those people that go all the way up the chain to the first of your family. So the most recent of those folks will have a hopefully a relative property on it. Now, in this particular case, I don't have relative on anything, so it kind of defaults to the window. So if I put in a property like right 20 pixels, this will actually go all the way to the right of the page and then off about 20 pixels. But that's to the page. Let's say I actually wanted it to the red square. So if I want it to the red square, I have to actually set a recent relative ancestor directly above, and now you can see that the button is now being positioned relative to my div. So that's important when you're dealing with position relative and position absolute. Position absolute is looking for the most recent relative ancestor, and the most recent relative one is this guy right here, our div. All right, so we're going to keep position relative on this guy, and we're going to move the button half the way down and half the way to the left. Now you would think, just with these two properties without looking what's going on over here, that this would center the button. And technically that's exactly what it's doing. But you might not be easy to see, but really what's happening here is the top left corner has moved down 50%, or in this case 100 pixels, and left 50%, or in this case 100 pixels. So it doesn't move it by the center, it moves it by the top left corner. All right? So we're kind of on the way there, but we're not entirely there, right? Now, in order for us to go ahead and fix this, we would need to move this button back half of the width that the button is, and move it up half of the height that the button exists. But this button is a variable dimension, right? If we end up changing the text that's in this button, it'll become larger in some way. Additionally, you know, increase the font size or even put icons in there. Anything is possible. So we want to be able to make sure that this button is centered no matter what kind of content goes inside of it. So what we'll do is we'll add one more property, and it's transform, and we'll put translate, which is a function looking thing. We'll put -50 and -50. Okay? And that will center our button every single time. Now what's actually going on there? So when we talk about percentage in CSS, it always is relative to the parent. So that means that we're moving top 50% of the parent. So that means that 50% of 200 pixels is going to be 100 pixels. So that's why it was 100 pixels to the top, and then 100 pixels to the left. And it's always relative to the parent when we're talking about percentage. However, when we're talking in the transform function, specifically, not the transform function, but the transform property, any percentage that we use inside of its functions, like translate here, are actually relative to itself. So that means that we're moving this back 50% of its own width, and up -50%, which would be up, its own height. So half of its width and half of its height. This is the X and the Y right here. Okay, and negative just means go back, right? And that's usually a thing kind of for CSS. So that's what's happening here. We've originally just moved the top left corner to the center, and then we moved it halfway back and halfway up to put the thing right in the center. And that's how we used to center stuff. There's other ways, of course, of centering stuff that we used to do, but they're very specific to the kind of elements that you're using. So like, for instance, in a table, you might use something like vertical align to try to center stuff, which is totally valid, but they're very specific to the application. But these methods that I showed you here are much more generalized ways of centering stuff. So that does it for today. If you have any questions, go ahead and you can leave them at the bottom in the description below, or in the comment section below, not in description, that's for me. And I hope to see you guys next time for whatever we'll talk about, and I hope it wasn't too long. And yeah, let's keep coding.